The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the white tablecloth, but Isadora felt only darkness closing in around her. She sat frozen in her chair, her manicured fingers gripping her wine glass so tightly the stem might snap, as Duncan's pregnant mistress laughed, laughed at something his sister Caroline had whispered in her ear. The woman's hand rested protectively over her swollen belly, a gesture so intimate, so claiming, that it felt like a slap across Isadora's face. 6 months along, maybe 7. Which meant Duncan had been planning this humiliation for longer than Isadora had suspected. "Isn't that right, Isadora?" Caroline's voice sliced through the dinner conversation like a blade dipped in honey. "You always said family dinners should include everyone who matters to Duncan." The table fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes, their closest friends, business associates, the very people who had celebrated her wedding to Duncan 5 years ago, turned to watch her response. She could feel their anticipation, their hunger for her breakdown, their cameras hidden behind sympathetic smiles. Isadora's throat burned, but her voice emerged steady as silk. "Of course, Caroline. How thoughtful of you to expand our definition of family." The mistress, what was her name? Savannah? Sierra, shifted uncomfortably, finally sensing the undercurrent of venom beneath the polite conversation. But Duncan, her billionaire husband, merely cut into his steak as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just allowed his sister to seat his pregnant lover at their anniversary dinner. As Isadora lifted her wine glass in a mock toast, her wedding ring catching the light, one thought crystallized in her mind with diamond-sharp clarity. They have no idea what they've just unleashed. Would she let them destroy her in front of everyone who mattered? Or would she rise from these ashes stronger than they ever imagined possible? Isadora Blackwell had never been a woman to accept defeat. The daughter of a civil rights attorney and a renowned surgeon, she'd clawed her way through Harvard Law before pivoting to art curation, building one of the most prestigious galleries in Manhattan by 30. She'd married Duncan not for his money, though the 9-figure fortune didn't hurt, but for what she believed was his integrity. His late-night conversations about changing the world through technology, his gentle way of tucking her hair behind her ear when she spoke passionately about injustice. That man felt like a stranger now. Duncan Vale, tech mogul and darling of Silicon Valley, had built his empire on algorithms that predicted human behavior. Ironic, considering how poorly he'd predicted his wife's reaction to betrayal. At 38, he'd grown comfortable in his power, surrounding himself with people who affirmed his choices rather than challenged them. His sister Caroline had always resented Isadora's influence over Duncan, whispering poison about gold diggers and social climbers who didn't understand family loyalty. The mistress, Sierra, Isadora learned from carefully orchestrated eavesdropping, was 26, blonde where Isadora was brunette, soft where Isadora was sharp. A marketing executive at one of Duncan's companies, she represented everything Duncan apparently craved: uncomplicated adoration and the promise of easy domesticity. But they'd underestimated Isadora's network. Her gallery didn't just showcase art, it hosted the wives, daughters, and mistresses of every power player in New York. Women who lunch weren't just socialites. They were information brokers, and Isadora had been collecting their secrets for years. As she smiled through the remainder of that humiliating dinner, watching Sierra giggle at Duncan's stories while Caroline smirked into her champagne, Isadora felt something cold and calculating settle in her chest. They wanted to play games with her reputation, her marriage, her very identity. Fine. But they were about to learn that she'd been playing this game since before Sierra knew what a hostile takeover was. The morning after the dinner, Isadora sat in her home office overlooking Central Park, watching joggers navigate the autumn paths while she navigated her revenge. The mahogany desk, a wedding gift from Duncan, now felt like a war room table as she spread out photographs, financial documents, and a leather-bound address book that contained enough secrets to topple governments. Her phone buzzed. Duncan, texting from his downtown office. Sorry about last night. Caroline went too far. Can we talk? Isadora stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. 6 months of lies, of stolen glances and suspicious late nights, of watching her husband's eyes grow cold whenever she entered a room. And now he wanted to talk. She typed back, of course, darling. Come home early. I'll make dinner. But as she hit send, her other hand was already dialing. Miranda? It's Isadora. Remember that conversation we had about your husband's business partner? The one with the creative accounting methods? Yes, well, I think it's time we discussed how that might relate to Duncan's upcoming IPO. By the time Duncan arrived home that evening, Isadora had made 12 phone calls. 12 carefully orchestrated dominoes, positioned and ready to fall. She greeted him at the door in the emerald dress he'd bought her in Paris, her smile radiant and devastating. "Darling," she said, rising on her toes to kiss his cheek, breathing in his familiar cologne one last time. "We need to discuss the future." The moment that would change everything had arrived, but Duncan had no idea he was walking into a trap 5 years in the making. Duncan paced their living room like a caged predator, his hands running through his dark hair as Isadora sat perfectly poised on the cream sofa, watching him unravel. "How long have you known?" His voice cracked on the last word. "About Sierra." Isadora's tone remained conversational, as if they were discussing dinner plans. "Officially, since the pregnancy announcement at your sister's little theatrical performance. Unofficially, since the Hamptons charity gala in June, when you disappeared for an hour and came back with her lipstick on your collar. Chanel Ruse Coco and Gabrielle, if I'm not mistaken." Duncan's face went white. "Isadora, Please, don't insult my intelligence with explanations." She stood, moving to the bar cat with fluid grace. "Scotch. You look like you need it." As she poured 2 glasses, her movements deliberate and elegant, Duncan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. This wasn't the breakdown he'd expected. This controlled composure was infinitely more terrifying. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. Isadora handed him the glass, their fingers brushing for a moment that felt like goodbye. "I want you to understand something, Duncan. For 5 years, I've been the perfect wife. I've smiled at your boring colleagues, laughed at your mediocre jokes, and turned my successful gallery into a showcase for your business connections. I've been so busy being what you needed that I forgot who I was." She moved to the window, her silhouette framed against the city lights. "But that woman, the one who stood by while your sister humiliated her in front of our friends. She's gone now. What's left is someone you've never met." Duncan set down his untouched scotch with trembling hands. "Are you threatening me?" Isadora turned, and for the first time since he'd known her, Duncan saw something wild and dangerous flickering behind her composed exterior. "Threatening you? Oh, darling." Her laugh was soft and deadly. "I'm promising you." The phone rang then, shrill in the charged silence. Duncan's business partner, probably, or his lawyer, or any of the dozen people who would soon discover that Isadora Blackwell Vale wasn't just a pretty face in designer dresses. She was a predator who'd been playing prey for far too long. 3 weeks later, Duncan's world began to crumble in ways he never saw coming. It started with the Wall Street Journal article exposing the creative accounting in his latest venture, numbers that only someone with intimate access to his personal files could have provided. Then came the Society column revealing Sierra's history as a serial mistress to married executives, complete with photos and testimonies from 3 previous wives she'd helped destroy. But the killing blow came during what should have been Duncan's triumph, the IPO launch party for his newest tech venture. 200 of New York's elite gathered in the ballroom at the plaza, champagne flowing as Duncan prepared to announce his company's public debut. That's when Tyrese Mitchell walked in. Isadora felt her breath catch as she watched the rival tech mogul enter the room, his presence commanding attention without effort. She'd known Tyrese by reputation, the brilliant, ruthless entrepreneur who'd built his empire from nothing, becoming Duncan's most formidable competitor. What she hadn't expected was the way he looked directly at her through the crowd, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Mrs. Vale." His voice was deep, cultured, with just a hint of the Detroit accent he'd never quite lost. "I've heard remarkable things about your gallery. Mr. Mitchell." She extended her hand, surprised when he lifted it to his lips rather than shaking it. The gesture should have felt antiquated, but instead it sent electricity racing up her arm. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." His smile was sharp, predatory. "I go where business takes me. And lately, business has been very interesting." Across the room, Duncan was deep in conversation with investors, Sierra clinging to his arm in a dress that barely contained her expanding figure. Neither had noticed Tyrese's arrival, or the way he'd positioned himself next to Isadora like a declaration of intent. "You orchestrated this," Tyrese said quietly, his words meant only for her. "The journal article, the scandal, the timing. It's brilliant." Isadora's mask slipped for just a moment, surprise flickering across her features. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you don't." His laugh was warm, appreciative. "But hypothetically, If someone had access to Duncan's financial records and wanted to tank his IPO right before launch, they'd need inside knowledge of his business practices and connections to investigative journalists. They'd also need perfect timing and nerves of steel. She lifted her champagne glass, using the moment to study his face. And why would someone want to do such a thing? Because Tyrese stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, cedar and bergamot, completely different from Duncan's lighter scent. Sometimes the only way to win is to make sure your opponent destroys himself. The revelation hit her like lightning. He wasn't just attracted to her intelligence. He respected it. For the first time in years, someone was looking at her not as an ornament or an obstacle, but as an equal player in a game she'd been mastering while everyone else underestimated her. "Dance with me," he said, extending his hand as the orchestra began a waltz. It wasn't really a request, and they both knew it. As Tyrese led her onto the dance floor, Isadora realized that her revenge against Duncan had just become something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in December, delivered by Duncan's attorney while Isadora was reviewing submissions for her gallery's spring exhibition. She read them once, twice, her coffee growing cold as the magnitude of Duncan's betrayal became clear. He wasn't just leaving her. He was trying to destroy her. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed in love and trust 5 years earlier gave her almost nothing. A modest settlement, no claim to their properties, and, most devastating, no right to the gallery space he'd purchased for her. Duncan was using her own success against her, positioning her as nothing more than a kept woman playing at being a businesswoman. Sierra had moved into their Hamptons house. Caroline was already planning their engagement party, and Isadora was meant to disappear quietly, grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they allowed her to keep. Her phone buzzed constantly, friends offering hollow sympathy, journalists fishing for quotes, business associates distancing themselves from the scandal. Each conversation felt like another small death, watching 5 years of carefully built relationships crumble because she'd chosen the wrong man to trust. The worst call came from her assistant at the gallery. "I'm sorry, Isadora. Mr. Vale's lawyers were very clear. We need to vacate the premises by the end of the month. The building lease reverts to his company." Isadora stood in the gallery's main exhibition space, surrounded by paintings she'd carefully curated, installations she'd fought to acquire, the physical manifestation of everything she'd built from nothing. Soon it would all belong to Duncan, another trophy in his collection of conquered territories. She called Tyrese that night, her pride finally cracking after weeks of his patient pursuit. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered into the phone, standing alone in her empty apartment. Duncan had taken most of the furniture, claiming it belonged to the estate. He's going to win. He's going to take everything and leave me with nothing, just like he planned. "Where are you?" Tyrese's voice was immediately alert, concerned. "Home. What's left of it. I'm coming over." "Tyrese, no. I can't. I won't be some rebound relationship for you to pity." "Isadora." His voice cut through her spiral with quiet authority. "I'm coming over. Not because I pity you, but because the woman who brought down Duncan Vale's IPO and exposed his mistress's history doesn't give up when the game gets difficult." After he hung up, Isadora looked around at the ruins of her marriage, her business, her carefully constructed life. For the first time since that horrible dinner at Caroline's, she let herself cry, not from weakness, but from the terrible weight of realizing that sometimes love meant learning to trust again, even when trust felt impossible. Tyrese arrived 40 minutes later with Chinese takeout, a bottle of wine, and a manila folder that would change everything. "Eat first," he said, unpacking containers on her kitchen counter with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to taking charge. Strategy requires fuel. Isadora found herself laughing despite everything. "Is this how you handle all your business crises? With low mine and fortune cookies? Only the ones that matter." His smile was gentle, but his eyes held that familiar sharp intelligence. "And make no mistake, Isadora, this matters." As they ate, he told her about his own divorce 3 years earlier. A wife who'd tried to take half his company, lawyers who'd painted him as a cold, calculating monster, months of character assassination in the press. "The difference," he said, pouring wine into the mismatched glasses that were all Duncan had left her, "is that I had resources she couldn't touch. You've been playing by rules that were designed to make you lose." He slid the manila folder across the counter. "So let's change the rules." Inside were photographs, financial documents, and legal papers that made Isadora's breath catch. Duncan's hidden offshore accounts. Sierra's real identity, not a marketing executive, but a professional mistress with a criminal history of blackmail and fraud. Caroline's gambling debts and the money she'd been embezzling from Duncan's charitable foundation to pay them. How did you? The same way you gathered intelligence on Duncan's business practices, Tyrese said quietly. Carefully, methodically, and with better lawyers than he has. Isadora looked up at him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not just the successful businessman or the charming dinner companion, but the strategist who'd been several moves ahead of everyone else from the beginning. Why? She asked. Why would you help me like this? Tyrese reached across the counter, his fingers covering hers. The touch was electric, but also steady, grounding. Because 3 months ago, I watched you hold your head high while your husband's sister tried to humiliate you in front of half of New York's social elite. Because you've spent weeks systematically dismantling his reputation without anyone realizing you were behind it. Because when you walk into a room, you make everyone else look like they are playing checkers while you're playing chess. He paused, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. And because I've never met a woman who could make revenge look so elegant. Isadora felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth she'd forgotten was possible. Not just attraction, though the pull between them was undeniable, but recognition. The feeling of being seen, truly seen, for who she actually was rather than who someone needed her to be. What happens now? She whispered. Tyrese's smile was dangerous and beautiful. Now, we finish what you started. But this time, you won't be fighting alone. The charity gala was meant to be Duncan and Sierra's coming out party as New York's newest power couple. 500 guests at the Metropolitan Museum, black tie elegance, and cameras from every major society publication. Duncan had planned it as his resurrection, the brilliant tech mogul moving forward from an unfortunate marriage to embrace his true love and their coming child. Instead, it became his funeral. Isadora arrived on Tyrese's arm, stunning in midnight blue silk that made her skin glow and her eyes flash with dangerous fire. She'd spent the week strategically leaking information to journalists, seeding society columns with carefully chosen details, positioning all the pieces for this final, devastating move. Ladies and gentlemen, Duncan's voice carried across the museum's grand hall as he raised his champagne glass, Sierra radiant beside him in maternity couture. Tonight we celebrate not just charity, but new beginnings. Sometimes life gives us unexpected gifts. That's when the screens around the room flickered to life. Financial records scrolled across museum walls. Offshore accounts, falsified tax returns, and embezzled charity funds. Then came the personal revelations. Sierra's arrest record for fraud, her previous marriages to 3 different men she'd left bankrupt and broken. Caroline's gambling addiction and the foundation money she'd stolen to feed it. But the piece de resistance was the recording, Duncan's own voice, captured during a private conversation with his lawyer, discussing how to hide assets from his gold-digging wife and ensure she got exactly what she deserved for thinking she could play in his league. The room erupted. Cameras flashed as guests pulled out phones, recording Duncan's face as it cycled through confusion, recognition, and finally, devastation. Sierra's composure cracked, her hand flying to her throat as she realized her carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time. You. Duncan's voice cut through the chaos as his eyes found Isadora across the room. You did this. Isadora stepped forward, Tyrese's steadying presence beside her. She was no longer the broken woman who'd been served divorce papers a month ago. She was magnificent in her power, terrible in her precision. No, Duncan, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. You did this. I simply made sure everyone could see who you really are. Security moved to escort them out as the FBI agents, whom Isadora had contacted weeks earlier about the financial irregularities, moved in. Duncan's empire, built on lies and stolen money, was finally collapsing under the weight of truth. As they walked through the museum's marble corridors, leaving the chaos behind, Tyrese caught Isadora's hand. How does it feel? He asked quietly. Isadora considered the question, surprised by the answer. Empty, she admitted. I thought revenge would feel more satisfying. That's because you're not really a vengeful person, Tyrese said, stopping in the shadow of an ancient Greek statue, its marble face serene in the dim light. You're someone who believes in justice. There's a difference. He turned to face her fully, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. The question now is, what do you want to build from here? Looking into his eyes, Isadora realized that everything she'd lost, the marriage, the gallery, the life she'd carefully constructed, had been built on a foundation of compromise and diminishment. For the first time in years, she could choose to build something authentic, something that honored who she really was rather than who someone else needed her to be. "I want to build something real," she whispered. "Something that can't be taken away by lawyers and prenups and men who think love is ownership." "Then build it with me," Tyrese said, and kissed her with the passion of a man who'd been waiting his entire life to find an equal partner in ambition, intelligence, and hope. 2 years later, Isadora stood in the gallery space of her dreams. Not the sterile white box Duncan had purchased for her, but a converted warehouse in Brooklyn that she'd bought with her own money, filled with art that challenged and provoked rather than simply decorated. The opening night of her Phoenix Rising exhibition drew crowds that spilled onto the street. Critics, collectors, and artists mingled beneath installations that told stories of transformation, resilience, and the beauty that emerged from ashes. At the center of the main gallery hung her own piece, a massive mixed-media work incorporating fragments of her old life, pieces of her wedding dress, pages from Duncan's business plans, photographs from that terrible dinner at Caroline's, but transformed into something powerful and beautiful. "Mrs. Mitchell," a journalist approached, notebook in hand. "Can you tell us about the inspiration behind tonight's exhibition?" Isadora smiled, her wedding ring, a simple platinum band chosen with love rather than strategy, catching the gallery lights. "Sometimes we have to lose everything we think we want to discover what we actually need," she said. "This exhibition celebrates that process of becoming." Across the room, Tyrese was deep in conversation with potential investors for his newest venture, a foundation that provided legal and financial support to women escaping abusive marriages. He caught her eye and winked, their private language of shared ambition and mutual respect. The journalist scribbled notes. "And your ex-husband? Any comment on his recent conviction?" "I wish Duncan well," Isadora said, and meant it. The anger had burned away months ago, leaving something cleaner behind. Prison is an excellent place for reflection and personal growth. As the evening wound down and the last guests filtered out, Tyrese found her standing before her Phoenix piece, studying the way the gallery lights transformed the fragments of her old life into something luminous. "Regrets?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Isadora leaned into his warmth, thinking of the woman she'd been 2 years ago, afraid to take up space, afraid to demand respect, afraid to believe she deserved love that didn't require her to diminish herself. "Only one," she said, turning in his arms. "I wish I'd burned it all down sooner." Their laughter echoed through the gallery space, rich and full of possibility. Outside, New York sparkled with the lights of 8 million stories, 8 million chances for reinvention and redemption. And somewhere in Brooklyn, a woman who'd risen from the ashes of her own destruction was writing the next chapter of a love story that belonged entirely to her. Sometimes the most beautiful endings were really beginnings in disguise. And sometimes the greatest revenge was living so well, so fully, so authentically, that your former life looked like a prison you'd finally learned to escape. The Phoenix had risen, and she was magnificent. Tell us your favorite love story of resilience and transformation in the comments. Hit the like button if you believe in second chances and the power of rising from your own ashes.